Hey, DickHeads! We've got a special pink laser beam of truth. Unfortunately, this one has nothing to do with Philip K. Dick, but fortunately it has to do with a really great author who was one of his peers, and actually very important to the Philip K. Dick universe, and that's a novel called Beyond Apollo by Barry Malzberg. I've got a special guest dickhead tonight. His name is James Reich, and you'll find out very quickly that he is super knowledgeable in science fiction, and you guys will be clamoring for him to come back to Dickhead soon, I'm sure. So, James, why don't you tell everybody your background and your history with science fiction?
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I'm a novelist. I was born in Stroud in the west of England. I live in New Mexico now. I come to science fiction through a couple of strands that might seem a bit incongruous. I come to it through a hybrid of bizarrely Dylan Thomas and Richard Burton. So I come to it from a Welsh angle. I used to be obsessed with the recording of the War of the Worlds and Wells's novel, but also Dadaism and surrealism. So I lean towards the experimental end of science fiction in terms of what I enjoy reading. So Dick, absolutely. Malzberg, yes. Burroughs, yes. Ballard, yes. Those are some of my touchstones. I also enjoy Bradbury, some of the legends, of course. But I've just finished my first. I won't even call it a straight science fiction novel. It's called The Song My Enemies Sing, that came out from a press called Anti-Oedipus Press. And they previously put out a couple of Malzberg books, Beyond Apollo and Galaxies. I happened to, lucky enough to be invited to write an intro to Beyond Apollo, which I think Malzberg got a kick out of, which is always a great relief if you're going to take on the work of a living author. Try to explain it and hope you don't screw up and offend them too much.
Yeah, and that's one of the
where I'm from and who I am.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I was really excited to have you be a part of this bonus episode of Dickheads, because you wrote the introduction to Beyond Apollo. And the reason I chose this Malzberg book to read, and I had read it once before, but I wanted to reread it. I'm trying to read more retro sci-fi this year. Try to go back to some of the classics, and not just because I'm already going to be reading a Dick book every month, so I thought I need to be reading some other retro stuff from the era. And one of the reasons why I wanted to read Malzberg is I learned, and I don't know if you know this, but Barry Malzbreg is so important to Philip K. Dick in part because he was the guy who read the slush pile at Philip K. Dick's literary agency in the 50s.
Correct, yeah.
And
yeah, Malzberg has sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead. You can add to that, please.
Well, Malzberg has these kind of really interesting threads. You know, he wrote in multiple genres. He wrote under different pseudonyms. For me, what I found interesting, I didn't realize, a kind of epiphany like you just had about, Dick and the slush pile was, I didn't realized when I first read Malzberg that he had been published by Maurice Girodias, who was Burroughs' publisher, published Naked Lunch, and he published Henry Miller, and he published all these works of literature that, essentially other modernist and late modernist and early postmodernist works that got people into trouble, got into the court system, got into obscenity trials, arguments about censorship. So I found it kind of fascinating that this very strange, not fascinating, but also completely understandable that this really challenging science fiction writer would have a background in the same literature, the same press, the same atmospheres as people like Burroughs and Miller and others, just through that press. It's kind of a little tangential in some ways, but it makes total sense to me in terms of the way Malzberg experiments with deconstruction, which we can obviously talk about as we move on.
Well, and so one of the reasons personally is that I had made it my mission that one of the people we were going to interview for Dickheads this year was going to be Barry Malzbreg, and that I was going to track him down, so I knew I wanted to reread one of his novels. And the reason I had Beyond Apollo on the shelf was because well, it was probably 10, 11 years ago. I was living in Western Washington, and I used to go often to Victoria, BC, and there was an awesome bookstore there called Dark Horse Books, which was basically science fiction books and political anarchist books. And the owner of the store, Robert Garfat, who's a good friend of mine now, on my very first time coming into his store, I told him I was looking for John Shirley, John Brunner, and Norman Spinrad books. And
Spinrad too, right?
Yeah, and that's who I was looking for that day. And when I walked out with a copy of Beyond Apollo because he said, "You here, read this guy too." And that was the first.
You found all the great ironists of science fiction, right?
Right.
Between Dick and those guys, yeah.
Yeah, and because I was just discovering Spinrad at the time, and I was kind of late to the game on Spinrad, but. And so I read Beyond Apollo at the time, but I don't know that I was quite ready for it at the time. I liked it, but not as much as I did when I reread it this last week. And so let's talk about Beyond Apollo. What do you know about the publishing history of this book? I know it won the John Campbell Novel of the Year Memorial Award at the time, but I don't know much about the publication of it. Do you know much about that?
I mean, I think I'm in the same place you are. I mean, I know about that. I know that it was, a controversial book, and I think I have some insight into why in the general kind of sense of literature. But in terms of like how it came into print, I'm a little in the dark about that, I must admit. But I think one of the things that's important for why it's such an important book in terms of science fiction lineage, not just because of winning the inaugural Campbell Award, but it does this very interesting thing, which is that so William Burroughs had written the Nova trilogy. He'd done Soft Machine, he'd done The Ticket That Exploded, and he'd done Nova Express, which were these very kind of interesting deconstruction kind of novels. They were the cut-up novels in a way that Naked Lunch wasn't a cut-up novel. Naked Lunch was simply non-linear and strange, but it wasn't a cut-up. And there's a lot of in the history of science fiction, we often look at Burroughs as a kind of a pivotal. That the Nova trilogy is important and pivotal, and it makes complete sense. But there's a really important difference between what Burroughs did and what Malzberg did, and even what Dick did to an extent in things like Ubik. In the Nova trilogy, in Burroughs' work, the technique assimilates the genre. So basically, deconstruction assimilates science fiction. Whereas in Malzberg, in his experiments in Beyond Apollo and definitely in Galaxies, which is also a very kind of experimental, deconstructed, postmodern kind of text, in Malzberg, genre assimilates technique, assimilates deconstruction, which is a whole different thing. It's a very exciting. In the 60s and the 70s, we have science fiction catching up, if you like, with the literary progress that had been made in modernism. The science fiction largely bypassed. When Moorcock talked about, wrote Why So Conservative and bemoaned, the state of writing, what he saw at least as the lousy state of writing in a lot of science fiction, it was partly because of I think you know this. I think about my thoughts on this is partly because Hugo Gernsback had basically turned science fiction into a no sex, fairly insular place where it was about humanism, positivism, and a kind of like benign colonialism, a benign imperialism that you see kind of even epitomized in something like Star Trek. Whereas luckily in the 60s and the 70s, we had the sort of new wave science fiction writers, with whom Malzberg is kind of loosely associated, turning inwards towards the psyche, towards the things that towards surrealism, towards Dadaism, towards collage, towards sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and basically rescuing, as I see it, rescuing the genre. When you were talking about the Don Zanzibar, Brunner's really great novel. When Brunner, what year did that come out? Do you remember the year that came out?
1969.
It's a very end of the 60s book, isn't it?
Yeah.
So like when Brunner's looking for technique, for a literary style to match his innovative ideas about character and concept and all that, he has to go back almost 40 years. He looks at John Dos Passos and the 42nd Parallel, the USA trilogy, to borrow all those techniques of newsreel, the collage of biography, the shifting perspectives. It's a novel from 1930 where Brunner found his strategy. And it's, thank God for science fiction that people like Philip K. Dick, people like Burroughs, and people like Malzberg also basically dragged modernism into science fiction. I don't know if I was thinking about this earlier because I knew we were going to be talking about some of this stuff, and I was thinking about how, in some ways we think of the 60s and the 70s as a kind of inward turn towards, away from the exterior, towards inner space, as Ballard and others called it. But really, it's not so much. I'm not even sure it's an inward turn. It's more like the return of the repressed in a Freudian way, where all the things that science fiction had kind of avoided through the kind of what I think of as the kind of the Gernsback tyranny emerges at last. The repressed material, the experimentation, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So I think it's really great to highlight someone like Malzberg, and as you did with Brunner, and also the great things that Dick did in terms of dragging the genre kicking and screaming out of the 1930s.
Well, and I think Dangerous Visions, the Harlan Ellison book, did a lot too.
Ellison likewise, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Dangerous Visions for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of these authors were all in Dangerous Visions, but and I think the thing with Beyond Apollo is, well, I mean, clearly with the title, and it's funny because, this book came out in 1972, so So when I bought this book first in 2009, which is the first time I bought it, when I read the title Beyond Apollo, my brain didn't immediately go to the Apollo space program, right? Because
interesting, yeah.
Because and I just assumed that this was eventually going to have some kind of metaphor about the Greeks or whatever, and because my mind didn't immediately go to the space program, but of course in 1972, Apollo was everything in space, right? That the world was kind of engulfed.
Yeah.
So the title Beyond Apollo had different meaning, I think, in 1972. It has, it's a less obvious point to, or the title is more obvious in 1972 at what he's trying to get at. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Malzberg had this kind of profound ambivalence about the space race, a lot of skepticism about, the idea of, the committee. He writes a lot about bureaucracies and agencies and committees, and I think, and the asepsis, as he calls it, of outer space, what Ballard also called, or in a slightly different way said, these great theories of the future would be boring, and we were having that problem with science, with the relationship between science fiction and the technology that was accelerating past it. So it was really increasingly hard to sustain the extravagant myths of science fiction, whether that was about the nature of what the planet Venus was like or what Mars was like. By the time that Malzberg's writing Beyond Apollo, all the myths of Venus, the bikini-clad, women on this kind of jungle planet and all that kind of,
things that were in the
teenage boy stuff and the canals of Mars, all that kind of stuff is debunked. We'd had these, and it's really sad. It's it's sort of depressing in a certain way that, we had this. I think in the introduction to Beyond Apollo that I wrote for Anti-Oedipus, I said something like that there was this kind of flattening of affect of that when we did the flybys of the planets, and then did the spectroscopy, we saw there was nothing romantic about it at all, and you talked about Apollo as this kind of mythic idea, and it's the same for Venus, the same for Mars, are these kind of personifications of certain kind of attitudes and archetypes, and they're loaded with material, but then when you actually get there, or you can't get there, of course, with Venus, everything's kind of you get crushed to bits and destroyed by acid, and it's just a beautiful place. And Mars is kind of, a little. I mean, I'm still obsessed with it as a science fiction myth. I still, just wrote about it, and in a way that was, to me, a throwback to sort of the Bradbury-esque romanticism around what Mars might be, or like Dick did in Martian Time Slip. That sort of like haunted vision of Mars. I think that's still interesting.
Right. Well,
but in terms of are there Martians? I talked about coming to science fiction through Wells, and reading Wells and listening to my favorite actor, read those extracts from Wells on the prog rock War of the Worlds LP. Those things are really important to me. But so I still it's disappointing. More than that, somewhat. It's a shame. But in the end, Mars and Venus, the myths were unsustainable. So
yeah,
in that context, the repressed material of sex and obscenity that you see in Beyond Apollo come roaring back.
Well, and some of the things about, and I had this argument with one of my favorite authors, living authors, is John Shirley, and he recently he and I had this kind of debate about, he wanted to update his 70s science fiction novel Transmaniacon to have more.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, he wanted to update it, and I was like, no, leave it the way it is.
I agree. Leave it alone.
Leave it alone.
Leave it alone.
And because he was.
Yeah, I have an old one of those.
Yeah.
Cover of that.
Yeah. Oh, I love Transmaniacon. But for example, with Beyond Apollo, all the out of date stuff with Venus and all that stuff, to me, it's part of the it's part of the time capsule of the novel, and I actually like those aspects of it. And this is a very out of date novel. If you look at the fact that he has like the Mars missions already getting to Mars and failing by 1976. Which was very optimistic.
Right, yeah.
And we're exploring Venus with humans in 1981 and whatever. So
yeah,
it's really optimistic, but at the same time, I appreciate that aspect of it. Now, one thing that he has kind of going on in here, and I don't know if you would agree with this interpretation, but one of the things that I kind of came out of this second time that I read it feeling is that some of the same points that Malzberg's trying to make to me seems very similar to what I got out of reading Lem's Solaris, although done in a more pulpy and kind of more psychedelic and kind of rock and roll way, with having the kind of the sexual aspect and all those things. But I felt like what he was trying to say is that he was trying to make a point of we're not ready for the insanity of facing the universe. Did you get that out of this? Because that's what I got out of it.
I think that analogy with Solaris is really interesting and good. I'd love to think more about that. But on the surface of it, as you say it, that makes complete sense to me. Mm-hmm. I think there is are we psychically ready, for the experience? There's a moment in the novel where one of the guys that's been on the Mars mission says something like, flattens the affect of the whole thing and says, the moon, Mars, it's all the same. It's all the same experience. And I think Malzberg says something slightly different. It says that in a way, or at least the novel says, if Malzberg doesn't say that there's a problem here with the idea that. Sorry, I just got a small interruption there. Now, one of the issues. Sorry, 1 second. Recapture my thought.
No, that's fine.
Just some work for Larry.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think so. One of the things that Malzberg seems to me to be interested in is precisely the psychic reaction. I think one of the things that is important about one of the games that Beyond Apollo plays is it's a really playful book, although it's a dark and quite sinister book. It's very playful. It has so many. I mean, to call them in-jokes would be an insult. They're kind of like terrific ironies and cryptograms and anagrams, paths to follow that are ultimately part of the pleasure of the novel. It's kind of an unending novel in some ways because the point of it, for me in some ways, is the intellectual, or as you kind of put it, like the psychic or the emotional truth of dealing with the experience, whether the experience of space travel is traumatic, which it is. We know that, from stuff like. I'm a really big fan of Mailer's Of a Fire on the Moon. I think it's one of the best nonfiction books ever written. But we know something about the psychology of astronauts. We know, and we have some of that. But the thing that's going on also is that. In the introduction I wrote, I referred to this. This might sound a bit of a tangent, but I promise I'm going to try and tie it up a bit.
Go tangent away.
I'm really interested in. There's a lot of of course, there's a lot of homosexuality and scatology and so on, and Beyond Apollo, but which is not the wild reference I'm going for. I'm not going for just the homosexual references, but Wilde wrote this dialogue in 1891, same year he did Dorian Gray, called The Decay of Lying. And he talks about one of the issues that comes up for Wilde in 1891 is that it's increasingly difficult as we get into realism, into the realist mode, to sustain extravagant lies or to sustain our our romanticism. And I think our romanticism is kind of crucial in terms of writing about writing effectively the big lie. Wilde talked a lot about in The Decay of Lying about the idea of the big lie. And science fiction had always been full of essentially what were turned out to be big lies, big falsifications, big romances about what space travel would be like, including whether it would be this kind of positivist humanist colonial experience, or whether and actually Malzberg and others say it's not, it's weird, it dredges up the unconscious in uncomfortable ways. But yeah, it's like, when you have this technological realist universe, something that Wilde called in terms of realism, careless habits of accuracy. I mean, I'm not so interested. One of the reasons I love Philip K. Dick, and one of the reasons I like Malzberg, is because I'm not a hard SF reader. I think the careless habits of accuracy kind of undermine what is, to me, the most interesting thing about space travel. I think what you're alluding to as well, sorry, to tie it up, is the psychic effect, is the effects on psychology. It's an existential enterprise as much as it's a technological enterprise. Mm-hmm. It's easy to satellites are technological, rockets are existential. And I think Malzberg's going through that, and he also, in the riddle that the captain proposes to Evans, whose name's like a phonetic anagram of Venus. He proposes this. He says, what's the truth of why we're going to Venus? And the kind of one of the experimental and great ideas of Beyond Apollo is that Evans then runs through the litany, the chronicle of all these different science fiction scenarios. He runs through we're being guided there by telepathic snake, and it's all a ruse, or in the kind of more psychologically traumatic way, that none of this is actually happening. The novel's being written on a piece of toilet paper by Evans in an asylum. You know, this is just, it's a completely schizophrenic novel. So, you know, to me, the great thing about Beyond Apollo is the sustained act of telling great lies and setting up great riddles in this kind of Sphinx-like way. The novel stays pretty open.
Yeah.
In a way that, you know, it's kind of anti-science fiction that way, because science fiction, Dick leaves plenty of stuff open. Dick's a great, you know, ironist and employer of ambiguity and ambivalence.
Well, and that's one of the things that having just done Man in the High Castle, it's funny because we, you know, made a huge point in our episode about that. Is it's Man in the High Castle is not about, ooh, wouldn't it be scary if Nazis took over? It's really about the inaccuracy of history and how, like, everything that the reality that we think we're being sold to us is potentially not real, right? And what's interesting about Beyond Apollo is I talked to a friend online the other day who through Goodreads who saw that I had finished reading this, and he said, "Oh yeah, the book with the psychic Venus snakes," and he kind of like poo-pooed it that way. And what was funny is
that's one of the jokes. You know, that's one of the
exactly.
You know, like one of the piss takes of science fiction. That's one of the satirical moves, the deconstructionist moves that Malzberg makes.
Right, and I told him, I said, dude, those snakes weren't real. that was
right.
That was all in his mind. It was all like one particular. Right. And so it was funny because he kind of like, I don't think he was reading as closely, right? And that just got past him. And then what occurred to me is that there are often times with some of the weirder science fiction where, you know, sometimes the ideas don't hit you right. And that's one of the things that's so cool about this kind of weird science fiction is because it's not for everybody. And not everyone's going to get it.
No. Malzberg's, you know, he's I'm not even sure. I don't even know whether. I mean, no disrespect. I'm not even sure he's that well known. But he's certainly where he is known. He's controversial.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the thing is,
and I think that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Malzberg is very respected within the genre, but he doesn't have the kind of notoriety that Philip K. Dick, for example, has.
Right. Yeah.
And I think his contribution to the genre, in a lot of ways, is huge, but it's in things of like working at the literary agency, it's editing novels behind the scenes and providing notes and he's impacted the scene in a lot of ways, the community that is not seen. So the fact that his novels are so overlooked is you know, and I, you know, listen, I've been reading science fiction since the 80s when I was a little kid, and I didn't read Malzberg until 2009. You know, when Robert put Beyond Apollo in my hand at his bookstore, and I don't know if I would have discovered Malzberg if this really cool bookstore owner hadn't like pulled the book off the shelf and made me buy it. And
the first time I read him was I was given my friend Stephen Andrews, who wrote a book for, oh God, I forget the press. Damn it. But anyway, it was the 100 best science fiction novels. He handed me a copy of Guernica Night, one of Malzberg's, for me, one of his great books, in about 1997. But I think before that, he was kind of unknown to me. You know, maybe I'd seen them. I'm not sure. I don't think many bookstores stocked him because he was, you know, he's one of those people that's in and out of print in terms of like contemporary editions. You might find them used, but it's not so common. So good for Anti-Oedipus and good for the other people that are like trying to keep the backlist in print and to allow us to see this great material.
And one of the reasons why we're recording this right now at all is because I think it's you know, look, DickHeads, our focus is Philip K. Dick, but we definitely, one of the things that we do every episode is, our Dick-like suggestions. And one of the things we want to do is make sure that the Dickheads, the true serious Dickheads, like check out some of these other authors, whether it's Ursula Le Guin, John Brunner, Barry Malzberg, like these people. We want Norman Spinrad. And so we're definitely wanting to widen the circle a little bit because, we're the three of us who do Dickheads are well read in the genre, but, obviously our focus is BKD, but we definitely want people to expand and see these things, because another thing is this novel Beyond Apollo is so appealing to PKD fans if they just give it a shot. And hopefully what happened is that they got partly into this podcast, decided they actually wanted to read it, paused it, went back and read it, and now they're here again. So let's get back
to the spoilers.
Yeah. Which we're not. I don't think you can spoil this book, really, because I think in some ways the more you're on the lookout for the cool things that it's doing, I think that's actually not going to hurt you personally. I don't think, as a reader.
No, I think we're supposed to decipher this book as much as we can, and I think we'll come up with many different interpretations. I was very conscious in writing the introduction to it that I wrote that I was delivering what for me would have been spoilers, but actually might have been quite minor parts of the book for other people. Just in terms of the way you read, the things that have affect for you, the things that have the particular meanings.
I definitely like.
I thought of something
a
second ago, a while back, but I've never thought of it when you said about the mythic Apollo thing. If we've got a second, sure.
We got plenty of time to just talk.
So I was. You talk. I honestly hadn't thought about this. I mean, I think of, I talked earlier about the way the 60s and 70s science fiction ushered in that sort of sense of delirium. We talked about the sort of permissiveness and finally entering the genre of sex, drugs, rock and roll, etc., psychedelia, psyche, the unconscious, surrealism, all these, and collage techniques, all these kind of stuff that have been around for a long time. And when you said, you thought for a moment that it was going to be beyond Apollo, as in the sense of Apollo, the god, rather than the space program, just in terms of, a linguistic play, I mean, the opposite, or if you like, the beyond Apollo, the Dionysians, Apollo and Dionysus, and Nietzsche and other, in his kind of formulation of the tragic, is the Apollonian idea of the dream, but it's also the kind of ordering principle, and the Dionysian is the chaotic. And in many ways, like, science fiction had been dominated by the Apollonian principles, by the linear, the phallic, the straight line, the humanistic, what did I say earlier? Positivist kind of agenda, that it was an outward, progressive, linear, ordered, technological literature based on mastery and competence. Whereas actually, when you reach the position of being beyond Apollo, to pun on that, then you are in Dick's schizophrenic, delirious, druggy, suspicious, paranoid, music infested, wild universe. You're in the Dionysian. Apollo, in that sense, makes mythic sense to me.
Yeah, and it probably does have a double meaning. I mean, I know, not to shamelessly plug my own work, but here I go.
Do.
Yeah. So I have my first solo science fiction novel coming out later this year, Goddamn Killing Machines. And what was funny is that when I named that book, that title has like 3 meanings, right? And I was really like, I knew that the surface level, because it's a kind of military sci-fi book, that there's going to be the surface level. But when you get into to the mindfuck territory of what's going on, that there's 2 other meanings to the title, and I think probably what Malzberg's doing is similar to. I just made the decision. I was like, well, if people, just laugh at the title and see like one funny thing, that's fine. They don't have to get the other two versions of what the title means right away. They get that later, that's fine. And I think what's going on with Beyond Apollo is that, when I said that the first time I was looking for some great mythic thing, right? And it was there. I just didn't necessarily get it the first time. And then
that's really cool.
Yeah, and the surface level, I got it the second time, and I started to think about like the history, and maybe that's partially because I just recently saw First Man and was thinking a lot about Apollo, but
there was a film in the works of Beyond Apollo for a long time. I remember seeing, I forget when I first saw it, but it's been a number of years since I came across a website.
It could be done interestingly, but I think what's cool about this novel is kind of the unreliable narrator structure and how there are aspects of like the what is real that come into. And first of all, by the way, anybody who knows me well knows I'm not a fan of first person narratives. But this particular time, it was necessary and it worked. And
it also works because Evans is first person, but he also dissociates and refers to himself in the third as well. He has this this dissociative aspect, which makes the first person a little bit more dynamic because you don't read it as like a lyric, so it's much more interesting in that sense. I think Malzberg, one of the things, Malzberg has a well, it's not even difficulty, that's the wrong way to put it, but he is, I think Dick is very difficult to film. I don't know what you think about that precisely, but, Malzberg is pretty difficult to film. It's textual. It's a page-based science fiction. It's not a sensationalist science fiction. It's not a space opera. It's not hard SF where people can look at the technology. It's psychic and it's non-linear and it's tricky in the same way Dick is. I think we've got maybe, I don't know what the right word is, but there's that, what's that cliche, like we're living in Philip K. Dick's universe. That Dick is kind of, we're more familiar already with the territory. So when you film Dick, I just heard a conversation just the other day between some 17-year-olds who were reading some Dick short stories, and they were appalled. They couldn't understand it. They thought it was total trash. That it was a terrible writer. Everything that was happening was completely obvious. And I wanted to interrupt them and say, well, it's because you're living in the universe of this established.
Right.
None of these things. You're not reading this in 1964. You're not reading this when the universe was shaping. When our consciousness or our zeitgeist was shaping around. Mm-hmm. That it does shaping around our best experimental literature and our kind of. I think this is not a word I think many people apply to Dick, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot with the kind of. Visionary writers, everyone from like William Blake to someone like Dick, that there's the shamanic quality, of being the person that has to go out there in the entropy, find the pattern recognition and bring it back and show people the way the world is and stop us either being eaten by the snake people or finding the answers, solving the riddles. Mm-hmm. So Dick did that, and it's difficult, I think, for relatively young readers who've, in a sense, grown up in the world that is, Dick's fiction is, everything feels quite familiar, of course, Malzberg is not quite so easy with that, but I think in terms of technique and in terms of the ironies and the levels and the confusions with reality and identity, I think that, to me, they're great allies in a sense, not literally allies, I guess, but yes and no, but they're in a constellation that makes total sense. So I would commend any Philip K. Dick fan, particularly the ones that like the weird stuff, particularly the ones that like the deconstructed, the novels that take on the more take on the nature of language and the psyche and representation, to check out some of Malzberg's weird books.
Yeah, so on that note, because I'm not super familiar with the other Malzberg books, let's wrap up Beyond Apollo a little bit first.
Yeah.
Overall, I would, initially I would have given this book 3 Psychic Venus Snakes out of 5, but in the second time I read it, I definitely bumped it up to at least 4. And the more we talk about it, I'm starting to lean towards 5 Psychic Venus Snakes out of 5.
Because, definitely 5. Yeah.
Yeah, because the thing is that this is a book that definitely the more you think about it and the further out you get from it, like I think I was more impressed with it after I closed the book than when I was actually reading it. Which is a weird thing to say, but I felt that way about several of the early Dick books. For example, like Eye in the Sky was one that the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. And then, so I definitely think that overall this is a masterpiece. It's deserving of the award that it won. And you said it was the inaugural John Campbell?
I think so.
Well, that's
I
interesting.
Could be wrong about that.
That would be back-to-back first-time award winners, because when we did Stand on Zanzibar, it was the first British science fiction and fantasy award-winning novel.
Now that you say that, I feel tentative about that, but I feel like that's my memory. Yeah, no, it was the first. I think 72. Beyond Apollo was the. Let me just grab my copy here. Hang on. Yeah, the first Campbell Award. So yeah, my memory is, I think, correct.
No, correct. Okay, so how do you think that this fits into memorializing Campbell? And specifically, is there something about this work that is Campbellian, really? Like, I think Campbell was one of the early editors that was really kind of pushing the genre to get a little wilder. Am I right? I
mean, more. Yeah, I think a little.
More so than Gernsback, for sure.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So maybe that's the case. I mean, I think, and maybe, I think what I understand of it is this is anecdotal, so this is not like research based. You asked about the publication history earlier, and I'm remembering now that I feel like this might be worth double checking, because this is my memory, but my memory is that the jury was pretty split about Beyond Apollo. Getting the first award, or getting an award, period. It has its pulpy moments. It has its appeal to the pulp reader. At the same time, it subverts that pulpiness. So, I mean, you can read it. I think it depends what kind of reader you are in some ways. I mean, you could read it and get a real kick out of it. Like we talked ironically a bit, about the telepathic snake idea. Uh-huh. And it's laughable, but it's not laughable, because it's precisely the kind of science fiction of the golden age. So when the captain says to Evans, "Why are we doing this?" and he gives that reason, and he gives other very pulpy reasons. I think one of the things I was trying to get across with the Oscar Wilde thing is I think although he's well aware of the bullshit, but there's also in Beyond Apollo an ambivalent kind of nostalgia for the potential of the genre that's kind of been lost. And after, in 1972, it was going to be absurd to write about snake people and telepathic things and, bikini women on Venus, etc. It was going to be absurd from then on, or at least, from years before that. It had already reached the point where, for me, in a way, it's like when science fiction flourished at exactly there's plenty of 19th century stuff I really like, but the part that speaks to me existentially and philosophically, where it flourishes, is almost the point where science fiction becomes impossible.
Well, and if you look at this one in 1972, we've already got some really, very straight-laced novels from Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, and that, and it's not like I'm against those guys, because I like those guys too. I know those aren't really your
me too.
Well, I like the weirdos a little bit more, but if you look at, and I don't know how the jury was split on this, but I do know that when Staying on Zanzibar was up against 2001 for the British Science Fiction and Fantasy Award, it was hotly debated. Like,
right, yeah. But when you think about 2001 as well, I mean, I think I see the tension and the argument there. I think, and actually, I was thinking about this before we spoke. Actually, about 2001, and I was thinking about how relative to. I mean, I think we think of it's always in the pantheon of great science fiction movies. It's often number one in science fiction movie polls and so on. And 2001 has, a completely avant-garde aesthetic, and the novel itself is actually quite avant-garde in its story arc and its conclusions, and it's actually quite the monolith in the novel is quite psychedelic, and it's a pretty interesting expansion of the Sentinel short story, etc. And when you compare it to,
and there's no real answer to what the monolith is until 3001, 4 books later. Really.
Yeah, and then when you compare that to something like Star Wars, which is a completely reactionary narrative, it's hero's journey again, teenage boy, it's a very straight narrative of archetypal storytelling. It does engage with like incest, fascism. It's operatic, but it's fundamentally a teenage boy's nocturnal mission. Like the Death Star scene is basically a bunch of sperm chasing down the canal, for their 1 in a million shot. It's like this ridiculous kind of hero's journey, teenage boy narrative, and it's a very reactionary space opera, pretty problematic and silly, entertaining when you see it as a kid. But like it's in terms of narrative, it's not. It emphasizes how avant-garde 2001 is by its being the best part of 10 years later, but being so old-fashioned. It's a golden age story.
Yeah, and that's an interesting comparison as 2001 to Beyond Apollo, because in a lot of senses, again, they're making similar points. I don't think the comparison is quite as apt as the Solaris one. However,
No, that's a good one. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I think it's a better comparison as Solaris. However, if you look at, it's 2001 is such a straight-laced, hard sci-fi. We're going to try to make this as realistic as possible, except this one element, which is the monolith, what that means. And that's one of the things is if you read the whole series through 2001, that there's definitely a hard answer to what the monolith is to Clark. And, he basically said, like, he knew all along what he thought it was. And so now it's funny because I can't go back and watch 2001 now that I've read 3001, right? I can't go back and watch it without my knowledge knowing what the monolith is, right? And I'm not going to say directly what it is because that's a spoiler, but it's one of those things of like when you first saw it, I would compare it to Mulholland Drive. The first time I saw Mulholland Drive, I was like, what is this? This is totally insane. And then as soon as I figured out what Mulholland Drive was, I felt like a moron for not getting it. Right? Like, you feel stupid. And I don't think that's going to happen here with Beyond Apollo, but I definitely think, first of all, I think any dickheads should go out and read it, and they should definitely give it some time to marinate and possibly read it a second time, because I definitely got a lot more out of it the second time myself.
Yeah, it holds up. It really does. I mean, it should be a little bit more. I think Galaxies too. I think Guernica Night. I'm a big fan of the Destruction of the Temple, which is this bizarre. I mean, the tie-in with Ballard there is a Kennedy reenactment kind of narrative, but Kennedy assassination rather, not just Kennedy, but specifically it's kind of Kennedy Golgotha crucifixion kind of narrative. Malzberg has these great. He has these really good pulpy touches. He's mental, but at the same time he's really smart. Okay. He's really smart about the archetypal and
Let's get specific on that. And so we have 2 more things to do, and then I'll let you go for your evening show.
All right. Okay.
Because you've done an awesome job, and I'm sure DickHeads will be clamoring to have you back. So
I'd love to come back. That'd be really fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a good time.
It's really a pleasure talking.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm really enjoying this too. So here's the thing. Let's start one thing first. Let's get very specific about what other Malzberg I need to read and the DickHeads out there need to read, because I've only read Beyond Apollo and a few short stories. So where do I go? Where do I go next? And then tell us specifically some of the works that your press is putting out, and tell us about your novels so we know where to go to read your work.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So that was 2.
Let's start with Malzberg.
So Malzberg first. If you like the experimentation, the postmodern touches, the playfulness of Beyond Apollo, you would definitely enjoy Galaxies, which I think in the intro I wrote. If you read this particular edition, which I hope you will, to Beyond Apollo, I think that Galaxies is the best novel about having an idea ever written. I think that there's a point in Galaxies where Malzberg addresses the reader and kind of says, if this wasn't a genre novel, if this was written by Coover or one of the, the current, or I think it's Coover, I don't think it's John Barth, but, one of the current kind of cool postmodernists, this would be taken in a completely different way. But this is a science fiction novel, so no one actually is going to grasp the level of experimentation that I'm employing in this. The first one I read was Guernica Night. I have a real soft spot for it. It's not as, I don't think it's, it's not as postmodern, I wouldn't say, or experimental in formalism, I guess, as Beyond Apollo and Galaxies. But to me, I loved the visceral prose in it. It's a really striking book. It is kind of Mailer-esque. Big fan of Destruction of the Temple. There's the remaking of Sigmund Freud's Sodom and Gomorrah business is interesting. That could have been filmed, actually. That might make an interesting film. I just delve in, but I think definitely Beyond Apollo is a great place to start in seeing the level of wit and the ambivalent regard that Malzberg, it's a love-hate relationship that he clearly has with the genre. And I think that's in many ways extremely healthy. Someone that is just completely besotted with a genre is not always making the best choices within it. And I think Malzberg has enough critical distance and just street smarts to write really good material within the genre and outside it too. The other question you asked was
your work.
My work.
And your press.
My press, yeah. So, the press first of all. So I've been running a small publishing house called Stalking Horse Press for a few years. We've published and are about to be publishing new work by Duncan Barlow, who I know you know. We discussed earlier, which is a great treat.
The City Awake, which you published, was one of my top 10 reads of the year it came out. So
City Awake is a great novel. His new book that's forthcoming in April is called A Dog Between Us. Very different novel, but it has, if you know Duncan, you know that Duncan has a lot of sensitivity and insight, and I think that this book it's a melancholy book, but it speaks to a lot of human truths, if that isn't too trite, but there's a way of describing a really great book. We published published poetry. Jennifer Maritza Macaulay, Jesse Janishek, Michael J. Wilson, whose recent book, If Any Gods Lived, is an astounding poetry collection about the era of AIDS and the aftermath, and living as a young gay man in the 21st century. Lots of other great novels by D. Foy, Scott Southern. Too many to mention. Kurt Baumeister, etc. I'm going to embarrass myself by not naming everybody, but I just, I think that you don't want a list of a dozen plus. You can go to the website Stalking Horse Press and check it out. Malcolm McNeil, an early collaborator with William Burroughs for 10 years in the 1970s, we just published a lost graphic novel of his called Tetra, which was serialized in a magazine for a long time, for a couple of years, and then just like a lot of Malcolm's exceptional, very, very, very important work for and in collaboration with Burroughs has been neglected, partly due to the negligence and sinister machinations of the Burroughs estate. I can't understand why Malcolm is not a household name amongst the Burroughs fraternity, community, but there it is. And my own work, I have 5 novels. The most recent is The Song My Enemies Sing from Anti-Oedipus Press, a science fiction novel, which Malzberg kindly enthused about, gave me some kind words. Previous to that, Soft Invasions, which actually the cover of Soft Invasion, The Man in the High Castle, where the book's quite, it partakes of some of the same paranoias. Before that, Mistah Kurtz to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and before that, Bombshell, an apocalyptic nuclear feminist thriller, and first of all, a book called I, Judas, which actually I incorporated Malzberg. Actually, now we talk about this, I incorporated Malzberg as a character, has a cameo within the novel I, Judas. So it's basically a novel about the archetype and the character of Judas Iscariot, set sometimes in Palestine, sometimes in our present day, and in a surrealist kind of present day. But yeah, Malzberg plays a cameo role in that. So I commend these books to your shelves.
Awesome.
Don't hesitate. Go.
All right.
Go sustain me.
We're gonna continue to chat offline for a minute about some ways that James can get involved with DickHeads. But anybody who listened all the way through, I really appreciate your time. And really thank you, James, for coming and bringing awesome insight.
Cheers. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. See you later, DickHeads, and keep it paired.